In today's event, which is being supported by the Fairtrade Foundation, we will discuss why we should tackle the UK's global environmental footprint if we want to build a more resilient, low-carbon economy, and what actions are needed to make that a reality. The UK is currently responsible for significant environmental impacts beyond its borders. These include the generation of greenhouse gas emissions associated with processes overseas to produce goods and services which are ultimately consumed in the UK, as well as impacts on biodiversity and other forms of pollution and environmental degradation. However, while there's strong awareness about the need to restore nature and reduce emissions generated within the UK, there has been limited focus on reducing the UK's footprint abroad, despite the fact that there's clear evidence that tackling the global environmental footprint is not only needed as part of a comprehensive approach to tackling climate change and restoring nature, but it is also vital to underpin a prosperous and resilient economy in the UK and abroad, as also recently emphasized by the Scopta review. Reducing the UK's global footprint will require action on a number of fronts, including through a reduction of our consumptions, switching away from carbon-intensive and nature-damaging goods, and improving processes and practices across global supply chains. The UK government has recently taken some important steps to start addressing some of the environmental impacts abroad, particularly through the new due diligence obligation being introduced through the Environment Bill, which aims at tackling illegal deforestation abroad. However, we think there's also significant opportunities to go further and to promote a shift to low carbon investment along supply chains and to more sustainable consumption patterns as part of the UK's plans for economic recovery, as well as the UK sets up new trade relationships post-Brexit. And we really look forward to explore what steps we can take to move forward on this agenda in today's event. To discuss these issues with me, I'm joined by a fantastic panel of experts. Joanna Macrae is co-head of International Forest, Agriculture and Land Use at Defra, and she's been at the forefront of development of the new UK law aimed at tackling illegal deforestation. Cathryn Higgs is head of food policy at the Co-op. Mary Kinyua is chair of Fairtrade Africa and member of the COP26 Youth and Civil Society Advisory Council. And Joe Blackman is head of forest policy and advocacy at Global Witness. Before I hand over to the panel to hear their thoughts, there's a few bits of housekeeping from me. There will be an opportunity for audience questions in the second half of the panel discussion. So please do put anything you'd like to ask in the Q&A box, and also feel free to upvote questions from others. Green Alliance's head of resource policy, Libby Peake, is keeping an eye on those questions, and we'll turn to her later in the discussion. Also, if you have any comments that you'd like to make, you can use the chat box to engage in the conversation and react to what the speakers are saying. And you can also tweet about the event and the discussion using the hashtag GAEvent. Now, to kickstart the discussion, Joanna, if I can turn to you first. So we mentioned the fact that government has recently taken some steps to start addressing supply chain impacts abroad, particularly through the new laws to curb illegal deforestation. Could you comment on how action on supply chains fits within government plans in the context of both sort of tackling the climate and environmental challenges, but also promoting economic recovery post-COVID?
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's great to be here. So I think basically the way that we think about this law is that it's part of a wider effort, I think, to start to tip the economic incentives in favour of a sort of low carbon, high nature economy. And I think the Dasgupta review, which you just referred to, kind of articulated the issue really clearly, that we need to make sure that it makes sense for forests and makes economic sense for forests and other vital ecosystems to be protected and restored. And I think in the case of forests, what that means is that we need to make sure that for producers, they reap the rewards of doing the right thing. And so the regulations that we're introducing is designed to reward those who are growing these commodities responsibly and in line with the law, and they'll find it much easier to access UK markets. So I think it's kind of part of trying to rebalance, I suppose, the incentives in favour of environmental outcomes. I think what we've learned in the past is that this type of approach is really good for forests, but it's also good for people and for the economy. I believe that you can have that win-win-win. And for example, we've seen that in the timber sector, where we saw significant increases in trade in timber between, for example, the EU and Indonesia after this type of regulation was introduced in partnership with the government of Indonesia. So we saw there that you were getting significant doubling of trade in timber, but you were also helping to get a reduction in deforestation. But we recognise that these transitions are not straightforward, they have costs. And I think one of the kind of big questions that we're going through is who is bearing those costs, and how do we make sure that that transition to a sort of low deforestation economy is a fair one.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Cathryn, if I can come to you next. COVID has certainly put the spotlight on supply chains and really highlighted the need to strengthen the resilience going forward. How is this shaping businesses' strategic priorities, and how is action on climate and nature sort of being considered within that context?
Thank you, Caterina. That's a really good question, and a very big question that I'm not sure I'll be able to answer all of that, but we've got some time to do that. So if I start really with the pandemic, so for us it became clear really on that as the pandemic hit, that growers and workers kind of globally were going to be impacted, and particularly those producers in the global south were going to have a really hard time of it, if not by the disease itself, but by the economic impact brought about by closure of shops, restrictions on movement and disruption of markets and kind of key transport systems, which may mean that products can't get to the markets that they're intended to. And also, you know, it goes without saying that kind of some of those producers just don't have the resources or the infrastructure that we've got. They haven't got a safety net, they haven't got savings, they haven't got the equivalent of a furlough scheme. And, you know, because of that, they're really going to struggle. If you add to that the fact that these smallholder farmers are also on the front line of climate change and are disproportionately affected by it, then the scale of the challenge that we're facing becomes more alarming. I've been really lucky enough to kind of visit a lot of producers in my time, and it always kind of hits me that every time I have a conversation with somebody, you know, it doesn't matter who they are, they all mention climate change because they are living with it and breathing with it, and it's a real reality to them. Whereas I think sometimes for people in the UK, it's a bit more of a theoretical or something that they see on a David Attenborough TV programme. And I think one of the things that keeps me awake at night, and I know worries my kind of co-op members and colleagues, is that, you know, climate change really means that we risk reversing some of the kind of gains that we've made. So particularly in terms of poverty, we know that climate change is going to drive people into poverty. And, you know, we've made some really kind of great improvements over the years, but, you know, climate change is probably going to reverse all of that. And I think, you know, we're kidding ourselves if we think that people can help to deal with the impacts of climate change as well as care for the environment. You know, if you can't afford your own kind of, you know, to feed your family, if you haven't got access to water, if you can't educate your kids and you haven't got healthcare, then environment kind of comes down the list a little bit, I think, really. So what's Co-op done about this? So I think it's fair to say that we've had to be really agile. You know, we've, like everybody else, been kind of, you know, a bit blindsided, I guess, at the start of the pandemic about how we're going to deal with things. So, you know, our immediate response was obviously to kind of make sure that, you know, we kept our shops running, that we kept our colleagues safe, and that we worked with our supply chain to make sure that they were also kind of protecting the workers in that supply chain. But also what we've done is, you know, prioritise our fair trade producers, and actually our buyers have actively protected fair trade products in our stores to really make sure that those benefits are kind of flowing back through the chain to the producers and the growers, because we felt that that was so important. So one of the key things that we did was that over the summer we launched our Global Wellbeing Charter, and we pivoted about £1 million worth of funding to support fair trade growers and producers with various forms of humanitarian and medical aid. But we also work with our producers globally around capacity building so that those suppliers could really help to operate their factories in a safe way, but also kind of understand how to deal with the impacts kind of emotionally and physically on their workforce. We also work with the One Foundation, and we're really lucky to have been able to support some really key projects throughout that time. And one of the things, again, that I'm most proud of, I think, is that we were able to work with our partner, the One Foundation, through whom we kind of fund lots of wash projects, and they were able to work with us and kind of develop some projects that meant that we could kind of target those wash projects into producer areas, so that some of our growers and producers could have access to clean, safe water, because how on earth can you deal with a pandemic if you can't wash your hands? It just doesn't bear thinking about. And I think it's really important as well to think about the fact that some of those producers, particularly in countries that I've been to, so in Malawi, we were able to support some projects with some sugar growers, giving them access to water, which, you know, Malawi is a country that's absolutely been devastated over the last 3 years through kind of extreme weather, which obviously is linked into climate change. So I think there's just been a huge double whammy on producers that, you know, we can't underestimate. And I guess from the COAC, you know, this year is the year of COP, like everybody else. We're focusing on our climate plans and kind of, you know, looking in detail about what we can do, both in the UK, both globally, how we can talk to our consumers about their consumption patterns, all sorts of different things. But I think, you know, at the heart of that are some really kind of key projects that we are looking at with our fair trade producers. And those are kind of really working around looking at issues like youth, in particularly in the coffee growing regions of Kenya, where we've been able to do a project with some producers there that's kind of helping them to build the resilience of their coffee plantations, but also it's meaning that they're able to keep their young people in farming, which I think is so important. And also a project that I heard about this week actually from the lady that's been leading that piece of work, which is a productivity project with banana growers in Colombia and the Dominican Republic, which is them helping themselves really to develop fertilizers, which is really helping them to increase the productivity of their banana plantations, etc. So all in all, we've been very busy. And we can't keep our eye off the ball on anything, but I think we're trying to kind of manage what we're doing with our own operations, thinking about our own sourcing from a UK perspective, but also keeping an eye out on what's happening elsewhere, because the UK still imports such a huge amount of products from overseas that we can't forget about it. It's incredibly important.
Absolutely, and I think just to follow up on your points, you mentioned that you are engaging with some of your with your customers also to raise awareness about the consumption. Do you think there is sort of a sufficient degree of understanding amongst the public on the impact that their consumption plays in driving environmental impacts globally?
I think it's really mixed. I think there's a real mix of knowledge out there, and I think there's a real level of you know, real desire to do the right thing across lots and lots of different kind of areas of the population, but possibly not that clear on what actually to do. So I think people have kind of understood that reducing, looking at kind of introducing more plant-based products into your diet is a great thing, both, you know, probably from your health perspective, but also from a climate perspective. But I do think that people are looking for some guidance and support, not just necessarily from the food businesses that they've got a transactional relationship with. I think some guidance and support from government in terms of actually what a healthy, sustainable diet is would be really, really helpful for consumers. I do always wonder, why would people listen to me as a food retailer on some of these issues? So, you know, we're a really great mouthpiece for kind of campaigns from other parties. So I think it would be great just to have some really clear, simple, sensible advice that people could follow, that we could then amplify through our channels.
Thank you. Mary, if I can come to you next. In fact, we are traveling sort of up along one of the supply chains. Can you share your perspective from sort of a producer organization also as to how you're seeing sort of climate change obviously reshaping your priorities, and what, how also you're engaging, or what kind of engagement have you had from the supply chain as on this subject?
Thank you, Caterina. So Fairtrade, especially Fairtrade Africa, has about 1.1 million farmers and workers. Fairtrade as a system has about 1.7 million workers around the world. Most of its producers have suffered climate change effects even before it became a theoretical conversation, or even before papers were written about it. Recently, of course, we've seen the effects of the hurricanes that have hit Central America at the end of last year and have wiped out about a third of the coffee crop in Nicaragua. So of course, as a system, we've introduced a number of programs to help producers adapt to climate change. And in Kenya and Ethiopia, for our coffee farmers, we've introduced something we call a Fairtrade Climate Academy. And we recently actually were able to get one of the farms certified as carbon neutral in Ethiopia through this program. We're also thinking about how we can support farmers and workers we work with to, of course, generally reduce their carbon footprint. And we've seen very innovative ways in which producers are actually doing this, because they leave the effects of the carbon climate changes. When it's supposed to be raining, it's hot. When it's hot, it's supposed to be raining. And these are some of the things that actually are causing low production. They're causing pest and disease pressure on chemicals, on their plants, etc. So they leave this every day. And our Fairtrade standards have encouraged sustainability, and especially the prohibition of the use of deforested land to grow crops. And we are keen, of course, to work with companies across the supply chain to achieve the net zero in the coming decades. In the COP26, where we are firmly involved, this is one of our push as producers to actually have the supply chain either incentivized or
we might have, Mary might be having internet challenges. I wonder, in the meantime, I might just move on to Jo until while we wait for Mary. Jo, we've heard obviously that there is that this agenda is rising up also as a priority for government and for businesses. Could you, I guess, just give us really a sense of why it's such an important agenda, why it's essential to get it right, and also potentially point us to what you see as some of the main areas of intervention where we can really start to shift to more sustainable consumption patterns.
Sure, thank you, Caterina, and thanks for inviting me to speak at the webinar today. Yeah, I think it's a really crucial year in terms of opportunities for the government on this agenda, and I'm sure all on this webinar today would agree as well. We know UK is preparing to host the climate COP later this year, and I think that gives a real window of opportunity for the government to show commitment on this agenda to both, I guess, capitalise on the momentum domestically and also showcase to the rest of the world what can be achieved to spur others into similar action. And obviously combined with that, we've got the coronavirus pandemic, which hopefully we're starting to see light at the end of the tunnel there. And I think it's really crucial that as we come out of that or plan to come out of that we look at rebuilding the economy and supply chains on a sustainable footing, really. And it's clear that businesses, including financial institutions that take greater heed of social and environmental concerns, are much more likely to be resilient in these turbulent times. And supply chains that perpetually require the destruction of forests and other natural resources are by their nature unsustainable and less stable, really. In terms of opportunity this year, there is a very concrete opportunity, which Jo alluded to when she spoke, which is around the Environment Bill. And as Jo at Defra has been focusing on deforestation, likewise Global Witness have, and we really see the Environment Bill as kind of quite a crucial opportunity for government, really. So the provision that's been introduced to the Environment Bill prohibits the use of certain commodities associated with illegal deforestation by large companies and requires them to undertake due diligence checks on their supply chain. This is really important because the production of UK imports of commodities associated with deforestation like beef, leather, soy, palm oil and timber has been shown to take up an area of land almost the size of the UK. And obviously deforestation is a significant source of emissions as well as driving biodiversity loss. So it's really crucial that we see some progress on tackling the UK's role in global deforestation, which is why that provision is so important. There are a few points where we think it could be strengthened. It only addresses at the moment illegal deforestation, and it was interesting to hear Mary just now reference the prohibition that they have on land that's been deforested. I'm sure if she's able to tell us more about that, it probably doesn't just concern land that's been illegally deforested, but all land. And generally, that's what we're seeing from industry is not just an approach addressing only illegal deforestation. So we really hope that's an area the government might reconsider. We also think it's really crucial that moves like this, moves on deforestation, really ensure they embed the rights of Indigenous people and local communities. And we think there are specific ways that could be done through the provision in the bill. And the final point that we're really pushing on is also around finance. And I know today we're focusing more on UK impact on the global environment through supply chains, but through UK financial institutions as well, we've got a massive role to play globally in environmental destruction. And in the investigations we do on deforestation, we see the names of high street banks, big UK financial institutions coming up again and again, and they're frankly just not taking seriously enough the impact that they're having on the environment. So, while the example I've given is specifically about deforestation, I think there are lessons for policy and government action more generally. And the first is that I think, we do need government action to drive the agenda forward. As Dasgupta made clear, the economy as it currently stands is failing to adequately value nature and biodiversity. And I think when you have market failure at that scale, that is where we need governments to intervene. And I think the type of due diligence that is in the bill is actually what we should be demanding of all companies eventually, and ideally, today or tomorrow, really, that they should be undertaking these checks on their supply chains and financing, and they should be held accountable for the environmental and human rights impacts of their business operations, both inside and outside the UK, and that this should be a routine cost of business. That's not to say it's easy, and it won't happen overnight, but I think that's definitely where we need to be if we are serious about seeing a better future for the global environment and for emissions and the climate as well.
Thank you. I wonder whether Mary is back online. If you want to come back on and share sort of some of the work that you're doing on this agenda.
Yeah, I'm just about to blame climate change for my disconnection. However, yes, I was actually focusing on one of the biggest problems we have when it comes to the issue of emissions. And one of the biggest challenges producers we have is actually the issue of transportation. Producers don't own any ships that transport goods to either supermarkets or to your countries. And it will take a lot of collaboration, because if you look at the carbon emissions, especially even just along the flour supply chain, with flowers flying throughout from here to Britain, for example, it will take a lot of more collaboration of all the actors along the supply chain, not only in transportation, but in a lot of other climatic problems that are created either by the natural processes of growing or the natural processes of supply chain, the supply chains. So above all, while we still support the drive to reach net zero, this cost of transitioning into net zero should not be dumped on producers. We have to find a way where those who are willing to be ethical and to consume ethically pay the price for it. So, something like put the money where the words are coming from. So this will help so that then everyone, we don't have one end of a supply chain struggling to carry the cross. We cannot expect, and it's even not fair to expect that the producers absorb this cost of sustainable methods of farming when they are often not even able to earn a living income or a living wage, because of the price they receive for their produce is far too low. And we should constantly ask ourselves, how can we do it differently together, not increase regulation to one part of the supply chain or decrease regulation to another part of the supply chain. So we welcome this event today and hope that this is a start of a brilliant conversation together for how we can achieve climate justice in global supply chain. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Mary. And in fact, if I can sort of follow up on that point about, first of all, the need to join up action across the supply chain. So really making sure that every individual sort of segment is sort of looking at future-proofing their activities with climate in mind. But also, I wonder whether Joanna can sort of tell us a bit more about how where can policy help to really tilt sort of the level playing field so that the incentives are actually rewarding those producers, those sort of actors along the supply chains that are investing in these kind of solutions. So I think that's obviously policy will play a vital role for that. So I wonder whether Joanna can say a bit more about how government plans to address that.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we're very mindful about is that I think, as Mary's highlighted, it's really important that the cost of this transition to more sustainable supply chains doesn't fall primarily on smallholders. And I think to kind of make that transition a fair one, there are probably a number of different things that need to be in play here. So one is about tilting. I think you used the expression around sort of tilting the playing field in favour of those who are acting most responsibly. And I think that's basically at the core of what we're trying to do through the legislation, is to make sure that for those producers who are doing the right thing and using land in compliance with local laws, they're not undercut by others who are less scrupulous. And that's why the prohibition on using products that have not been produced in line with local laws is really important. I think more broadly, I mean, part of it is this type of conversation. And again, I think it was fascinating listening to Mary about this interplay between the sustainability and in terms of things like the fair trade movement. So I think kind of growing that market and that kind of spirit, I suppose, in terms of the way that we think about our food and consume it will also be vital. And then very practically, I think there's quite a lot of upfront investment that is needed to make this transition. So much as we've seen in terms of making the transition away from fossil fuels to renewables, there's been an upfront investment cost. You could also say an investment opportunity. And I think we're going to be looking very hard through our own international climate finance, but also more broadly, both from the multilateral development banks and also to green finance, to help to fund some of those transitional costs. And I think one of the real challenges in terms of mobilizing that finance is to make sure that it's really reaching the last mile, that it's reaching those smallholders, not just the kind of medium and larger companies. So I think there's quite a lot to do, and it's quite a complex package. And one of the reasons we're excited about COP26 and the campaign that we're running there is because I think that provides a bit of an opportunity to think about what are those different elements, and to secure commitments from government, but also through our multi-stakeholder engagement more broadly, bring that package together.
Thank you. And in fact, sort of reflecting on that point about obviously it's a complex agenda, and it involves a number of sectors, a number of stakeholders in the UK and globally. But if we take a look at how to ensure that policy across Whitehall is really seeing this as a priority and really addressing it with urgency, to what extent? So how is Defra engaging, for example, with other departments and ensuring that there is join up, both in terms of domestic policy, but also potentially in the way that the UK goes about developing trade partnerships?
Thanks. Yeah. So I mean, I think you can see from the speed at which we've kind of put forward the due diligence legislation, which is the first time that any country has done this. We are taking the issue very seriously. So the GRI issued its recommendations on this issue back in March 2020. And by August, we had a public consultation, and by the end of, well, shortly, and we've got an amendment, a government amendment, passing through Parliament at the moment. So I think our level of commitment on this issue, I hope, isn't in doubt, given the sort of speed with which we've acted on this. I think basically the process of pulling together the GRI has been a genuinely cross-government effort. It's co-owned between Defra and BEIS and FCDO. And I think we work very, very closely across those three departments. And I think with FCDO, it brings us that network through our diplomatic posts. And then, of course, we're also working with DIT. So we have an interministerial group that brings together ministers from Defra, BEIS, and DIT to consider how to take forward the trade-related components of the GRI. So I think there's a lot of backing from the different departments, and of course the Prime Minister has made very clear his commitment to nature, and that's a very consistent theme, I think, of his interventions during this super year for nature, including as we go into COP.
Great, thank you. And Cathryn, if I can ask you maybe to comment a bit more also on what are some of the challenges that businesses, so we mentioned obviously some of the challenges that producers are facing, but also what are some of the challenges along the supply chain that businesses are facing when wanting to switch to more sustainable goods and services? And where do you see, for example, what kind of policy change would you think, do you think would help you to address some of those challenges?
I think that, there are supply chains, as everybody on this panel and the audience knows, are incredibly complicated and complex and change quite rapidly. So just that kind of transparency down the supply chain is one of the first things that businesses need to invest in to kind of understand that. In terms of kind of transformation and change, I think, if I thought about what kind of policies would help from a government perspective, then I think, the deforestation legislation that's been discussed and proposed at the moment is a really great start. I think legislation is really important in terms of providing a level playing field for businesses. It gives security that kind of investment in that piece of activity is the right thing to do. Obviously, there's always the question around, we need good legislation, we need legislation that's easy to follow, that businesses can interpret in a consistent and a uniform way. And obviously, it needs to be enforced in a pragmatic and a sensible way. But I think, as the challenges become more apparent, I think regulation and potentially other forms of intervention that might incentivize businesses to do the right thing are all the kind of policy things that we're going to need. So if I think about something that's from a different area, but the work that that's come out of the waste and resources plans in terms of kind of encouraging businesses through regulation to increase the amount of recycled content in their products is a really helpful thing in terms of driving change. So I think we've gone beyond really the time when kind of individual businesses need to be kind of taking the initiative. I think we need kind of clarity to make sure that we get that change and transformation at scale. So I think we are now in the place where some helpful legislation, regulation is the right thing to do.
Thank you. And Mary, I don't know if you also have any thoughts on sort of where would you see policy change also supporting fair trade producers, for example, and facilitating that investment along the supply chain, making sure that then those that are switching to sort of more sustainable practices are also rewarded. Yeah, I think we're still having, there's other internet issues. In that case, I wonder whether we can now turn maybe to Libby and see if there are any questions from the audience that we can ask to the panel.
Yeah, thank you, Caterina, and thank you for all your questions so far. Please do keep them coming. We have had quite a few submitted in advance as well. And I'm going to start with one of those because it relates to things that have just been said about policy. And the question is, what's next for government after the due diligence provisions for forestry products? And if I can editorialize a bit, I'd be keen to understand how we're going to move to other sorts of products, other sorts of commodities that also have environmental impacts, and also looking at other impacts beyond just deforestation, things like pollution and biodiversity loss. So maybe that's obviously directed at Joanna Macrae, but I'm sure other people have some thoughts on what's most important to tackle next too.
Great, yeah. So Joe, do you wanna, Joanna, do you wanna go first, and then if others have want to also respond, just jump in.
Yeah, good to start with the easy one. So I suppose sort of in the spirit of conversation, I think I probably need to eat what's on our plate right now. And that's we're still not through primary legislation on this one yet. Hopefully we'll be aiming for all assent by the end of the autumn. And of course, the legislation will only really come into operation once we've got secondary legislation, which is in turn quite complex. So I think we'd really like to get the forest piece sorted out first, and I'll be really interested to hear people's views about what their wish list might be for the future.
Jo, did you want to come in sort of on that?
Yeah, thank you, Caterina. Yeah, I would agree with Joanna on that point about, we've got to prioritise this initial piece and make sure we get it right. The primary legislation is going through, that a lot of, as ever, the devil will be in the details. So we really need to look at the secondary legislation. I think primary legislation doesn't even list the commodities, for example, that would be covered. So, we really need to be looking at getting the secondary legislation right, as well as the primary. I would say, I think, yes, we do need to have an eye on where we'd like to end up as well beyond that. And certainly from Global Witness's perspective, I think the ideal scenario would be where we have this type of mandatory due diligence across a much wider range of commodities and companies, actually, and have that requirement that they undertake due diligence to assess the environmental impact of their operations and supply chains and investments, and for also that to cover human rights as well. My colleagues in Brussels are engaged in some quite interesting pieces of legislation in the pipeline there, including an initiative which would do just what I've described, and would bring in this broader mandatory due diligence on human rights and environmental impacts. And we're expecting that to come forward later this year at EU level, alongside some due diligence legislation on deforestation as well later this year. So I think that would ideally be, that's where we should be look towards heading. Whether that's possible given some of the political and economic constraints in the UK at the moment, I don't quite know. But I did just want to pick up on one other point that Joanna was talking about earlier, in terms of the coherent approach across government. And it might not surprise people to know that I don't take quite such a rosy view as Joanna does. And I've got full of praise for Defra and the work they've been doing on deforestation. But we are struggling to get serious engagement from the Treasury. And I know colleagues working on trade are really worried about the impact of trade deals as well. And I think to really get the sort of systemic change that we really need from regulation and legislation, it really needs leadership right from the top. And it needs to be an approach that isn't just focusing on a small number of commodities nor a small number of environmental impacts, but is much wider and is really about shifting that kind of corporate accountability for those impacts. And that's where we'd like to end up. I think we're some way from being there in the UK yet, but the deforestation work is a really important first step, I think.
Thank you, Jo. And since we have Mary back on the line, I wonder if I can bring you back on, if you could comment maybe on what you would want to see from the UK in this year, where the UK is hosting the climate conference in Glasgow in November, and it's also the president of the G7. What do you want to see the UK do, sort of take forward? How should the UK take forward this agenda internationally?
I think the first step is in the invitation of a producer in the COP26. We really feel, that the UK government has really gone out of their way to try and involve the most affected people in this, or one of the biggest partners in this matter. And then, of course, we'd like to see the UK government set a target for consumption-based emissions, including from international aviation and shipping. And now I'm hearing even from the banking industry, etc. I would also like to see, especially, the support for innovation. The producer does not have these resources. And I like, I think, Joanna's point on the fundraising and raising this financing problem with the international community, ensuring that we support innovation and investment in zero carbon freight solution. And I like this comparison to the renewable energy journey in the amount of investment that has been put in it. Aid programs that partner with UK businesses should at least support producers to decarbonize. So that also would be something that will help, maybe around incentivization. I'm not sure about legislation for the business community, but just incentivization. And on due diligence, Fairtrade supports the introduction of a law to tackle deforestation as part of the Environment Bill. So it'll be very important that small farmers and workers are supported, especially with the cost of complying with due diligence measures, and that these measures are robust, and that those who don't support or do not comply are actually heavily penalized, so that then those who do right are rewarded, and those who do not do right actually are not rewarded. So we generally like the, especially this presidency, the COP presidency, and how serious the UK government has taken it. And we are hoping that we'll get practical solutions out of it, not just papers and theories, and practical solutions that actually change the lives of everyone in the world.
Thank you. Libby, if there's any other question from the audience.
Yeah, thanks. We've actually had a couple of questions about border carbon adjustment, which is something that's obviously been rising up the agenda. And in relation to a lot of concern that people have been expressing about the costs of transitions, there's been some suggestions in the questions as well that possibly revenue from border carbon adjustments could be used to help fund the transition for those who are negatively impacted by it. So this is open to all panelists, I suppose. What do you all make of border carbon adjustments? Are you in favor of them, and what should happen to the revenue?
I'm looking for volunteers to step in on this question. I wonder whether Joe might want to have a say.
Sure, I must confess to not being familiar with the detail of adjustments. I think the point I would make is, yes, for all the reasons other panelists have said, we do need to support producers, a particularly small scale producers, to help them with the transition. I think the 2 points I'd make in addition is one, a lot when we in the course of our investigations on deforestation, a lot of the local communities we speak to don't feel like they have personally benefited from the type of deforestation for industrial agriculture that we're seeing. So I think it's important also to make that differentiation about who might be winning and losing from this, and yes, smallholders, are really important, and livelihoods are, but too often we see some of the profits from this environmental destruction all too often being siphoned off and going to an elite and a small group of people, and not shared amongst the communities. So I think truly kind of sustainable agriculture means sustainable for people and planet as well, and that's not the model that we're seeing associated with some of the large scale deforestation that's happening globally at the moment. And there is money in the system. This isn't there is money. There are people making a hell of a lot of money out of this deforestation and environmental destruction and human rights abuses globally. It's no big mystery. You can quite easily find the big names of the companies and the financiers that are bankrolling them, and I think they need to be paying. I think there's you can debate which mechanisms and how, but I think there's a clear responsibility that's lying with some of the corporate actors that are benefiting from that, and that's why this action is so crucial, and crucial for us to get it right. But I think we need to be careful not to be too distracted by trying to set up new mechanisms of funding, because I think, yes, it's important the funding is there, but we know the money is in the system. Let's try and make sure it gets the people, and the corporates ultimately are held accountable.
Joanna, did you want to come in on that?
Well, I was going to say, you won't be surprised that I'm not going to kind of make a particular comment on that specific mechanism, but I think there are a range of options in terms of how you incentivize low carbon trade. And I think there's a real opportunity with the changing of the guard at WTO is very exciting in terms of how she's likely to be looking at how different trade levers can deliver for climate and for nature. And certainly that's one of our priorities at WTO, is to look at that range of mechanisms. And then I think just to reflect a bit on what Joe was saying, is that there are a whole range of different potential ways of funding this transition. You've raised one of them, but I think we're also seeing a lot of interest in things like voluntary carbon markets. I think there's a lot of money held through, for example, the multilateral development banks. So I think there's a range of options, and I think it's kind of thinking about how to make sure that once we've identified those different streams of finance, how do we make them flow, particularly so they benefit the smallholders? And I think that's the huge challenge, is really making sure the finance is reaching that last mile in the most effective way. Thanks.
Thank you. I want, Libby, if you want to flag another question from the audience.
Thanks. Yes, we had a question which is relates to something that Mary was talking about earlier, but which is about consumption emissions. And it'd be good to hear the panelists' thoughts on what needs to be done and what government should be doing. Should they be reforming the CCC's mandate to also include imported carbon emissions and consumption emissions, or what's the best way to tackle that issue?
Mary, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, Libby. I think consumers are actually right to demand that the products they buy are produced to the highest possible environmental standards. And I think if you have this push from the consumers, we expect that then producers then meet this expectation of the levels of ethical production that is required. Now, if we do not, then consumers actually will shift away from certain imported products, and that could be very harmful for producers. So who would then have to look for new markets that most probably are going to be unfairly traded, and will have even a worse climate crisis. So we have to look at this wholesome, not just apart, but wholesome, and I hope we can all work together to try and say, okay, what does the consumer want? How can the producer meet this? And what do we do to ensure that that actually happens? Because if it doesn't, or we leave one part, the 1 degree warmth around the world is going to keep rising, and we will not be able to mitigate around
it. Joe, did you also want to comment on this point?
Yeah, I think that question's really interesting. You know, I think there are obviously lots of reasons why UK government policy focuses mainly on territorial-based emissions, not least, you know, because that's the IPCC framework, and that's the way of accounting for it. But I do think, particularly in the case of a country like the UK, where so much of our manufacturing has been outsourced overseas, it definitely misses the bigger picture and does risk skewing policy away from actually taking into account the emissions that we really are ultimately responsible for. And when I last looked, that was nearly half of UK's carbon footprint were these consumption emissions. And when I looked, so there might be others on this webinar more expert on this than I am, but when I looked in detail at those emissions, I think even those consumption emissions don't even cover land use change or deforestation. So I think actually those figures could be even higher when we take into account, you know, particularly the fact that deforestation is the second largest source of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And you know, the international trade in fact drives around 1/3 of deforestation related emissions. So I think I would you know, hazard a guess that it would be even higher than that. And there's no doubt that figures, you know, and targets do drive government policy. So the more that we can do to correct that by finding some way to take that into account, and Mary kind of rightly pointed out as well, the emissions associated with aviation and shipping as well. So I do think we need to find some way of addressing that within our own, both within our own emissions calculations and also with you know, the policies that then accompany that. And they are difficult. They can be difficult to estimate, and I think that's also a challenge with consumption-based emissions is how you get those figures quite right. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try and model that, because, like I said, it's so important in then driving the policies that are going to make the difference, and the priorities of government on that as well.
Thank you. And in fact, there is the Committee on Climate Change in their latest report advising the government on the 6th carbon budget. They do comment very extensively on the UK's carbon footprint beyond its borders, and they also highlight a number of policy levers that the UK could implement to tackle those emissions. So I think there's really scope for really reducing those in a number of ways. Libby, we probably have time for one final question from the audience.
Yeah, I think you're right. And in that case, I'm bound to ask the one that's been upvoted the most, which I suppose speaks to the question of ensuring that we're tackling all different sorts of impacts at the same time. So the one that's been liked the most is how much stress on the wood and pulp supply chains towards more paper and I suppose card does the drive away from plastics have? And are we potentially looking at a situation where we've not necessarily got the sustainable supply? I suppose it'd be most interesting to hear from Co-op in the first instance on that one.
Cathryn, yes, if you wanna jump in.
Wow, and that's a complex question, and I think it's one of the things that I'm certainly kind of is a challenge that we've got, is to try and kind of optimize the right materials for the uses that we've got. So in terms of packaging, if we're using glass, for example, we should be lightweighting that glass, but should we be moving into an alternative material, looking at the kind of carbon impacts of that material in terms of its production, then in terms of the whole life cycle of the product? It's really, really complicated when we get to that level. I think, I would be looking at talking to somebody like Joe or Joanna to kind of help, guide us through the kind of complexity of all of this. But, we are very, very cautious around kind of making those changes, because we are absolutely alive to the law of unintended consequences. And the last thing we want to do is to jump out of something into something else. So, we have been taking a huge amount of thought and consideration in terms of our packaging policy, lightweighting our packaging, changing to other materials when we understand that those impacts are lower. And also kind of, looking at what we do around the whole issue around reuse or loose products, but again, being alive to the challenges that, we operate really, really small shops, and how those shopkeepers are going to deal with those loose products in that store and maintain safety, quality and product integrity. So it's a whole can of worms, I think, that issue. And I think I'll definitely be having a chat with Joe after this to try and understand what the best kind of way to navigate through that would be, and with Joanna.
And in fact, we may ask Joanna at this point whether she wants to also comment on this specific issue.
On the sort of unintended consequences. I mean, I think I was just going to say sort of more generally that I think that what is quite interesting when you start to sort of supply chains, because they are very, very complicated, you do start to you sort of unwrap one problem and there's a sort of another one inside it, so almost like a Russian doll. And so I think when we've got these very, very complex problems, you have to kind of have these very strong alliances, I think, between government and business and civil society in order to try to kind of put our different perspectives in one place and think about what are the different roles and responsibilities of each of us. And I think what we're seeing sort of emerge in the deforestation space, I think, is that sort of quite interesting alliance where you've got a sort of a number of governments and regional trading blocs thinking about regulation, and that's part of the big contribution that government can make. And then what you've also got is a set of very committed businesses, and then you've got a set of quite committed progressive folk in the financial services industries, and then you've got a very active and vibrant civil society network that's kind of keeping an eye on us all and encouraging us to do more and faster. And I think kind of learning from those very constructive collaborations, both, within particular territories. So obviously I've been very focused on our domestic legislation, but it's a kind of an international problem. But I think the more that we can set up those sort of sweet spots of collaboration in order to try to work through, how do we address these complex problems, and particularly to remain quite agile, because necessarily we're having to work on some of these issues quite quickly. I mean, you're talking about the transition away from plastics, which is certainly not my area, but what you're flagging is that you could do one thing and then it reveals the sort of next challenge. And so that's going to mean, I think, that the way we need to work together is going to have to be quite agile and have quite a lot of feedback built into it so that we can respond quite quickly.
Thank you. And certainly, yeah, taking a sort of a comprehensive look at really what's the scope, the full scope, rather than narrowing down on a specific issue. We only have a few minutes left, and I'd like to ask the panel for their final thoughts, reflecting perhaps on what is the one thing that they would like to see happen as the UK and other countries recover from the economic impact of COVID, to make sure that we tackle the UK's global environmental footprint and support low carbon investments along supply chains. I'll start with Cathryn, if we can keep it relatively brief.
I think the key thing that I've taken away from this really, and I think Joanna explained it really well, is the importance of cooperation and collaboration across the supply chain. No one business or organisation has all of the answers, and to kind of drive our way through this, we're going to have to listen to each other, and not just to, you know, to kind of experts over here. We also need to kind of talk to our producers, the growers, and find out what the real issues are that everybody's dealing with. And I think, you know, it's only through kind of coming together and kind of analysing the problems and the issues that we've got in the round in that way that we're going to find a way through this. I think, you know, Co-op doesn't have all the answers to this by any stretch of the imagination, and I'm sure none of the other speakers on the panel would think that they had. So we just have to talk, we have to come together, and we have to, I guess, put, you know, some of the competitive issues aside to find some kind of real solutions.
Thank you. And Mary, what would be your one wish to move us forward on this agenda?
Only one wish. I think I would really urge the UK, the world consumer, to think about consumption wholesomely. I would like to see us coming with solutions that work for all of us, but still achieve the same gain. So Joanna, as you craft regulation, as you present this, the question is, does it make another person worse off? Does it, for us to get a better world, does one end of the supply chain we have to be worse off? Because we are struggling with the same effects. We are as passionate about climate change and the effects, because we also have, I have a 3-year-old who also needs to live in the same world, and I'm trying to keep it safe. But my resources are limited. So we need to collaborate, work together, find a balance where the world is better without any part of the supply chain being diminished. I think the COP presidency is doing a pretty good job, and we're very hopeful that a practical solution to this problem, not just papers, but practical solution will come forth.
Thank you. And Joanna, what's in your wish list, top of the wish list for this year?
It's difficult, isn't it? But I think what I'd really love is to see at Glasgow a sort of platform of people that from all over the world, where I think we've stopped talking about this as a bit of a zero-sum game, where it's sort of quite a polarized debate around managing some of these risks, and that we're managing to really find that opportunity where, with the right level of investment and collaboration, it's possible to end up with that win-win-win that I think we're seeing, for example, on timber, in emerging, albeit quite slowly, and to see that happening in more places for more commodities.
Thank you. And Jo, a final word from you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it would be to see real progress on this deforestation legislation in the UK, and more broadly globally as well, as part of a move eventually towards stronger corporate accountability for human rights abuses and environmental harm. And the one other point I want to make is the Environment Bill also has so many other provisions as well as deforestation, and there's a lot of frustration that it keeps being held up. So I think to have from government some really strong legislation in the form of the Environment Bill not be further delayed, and actually provide that kind of predictability and clarity that is so needed by so many in the sector.
Thank you, and thank you all for a very interesting and insightful discussion. I think it's absolutely clear there's a strong case for tackling the UK's global environmental footprint, both to ensure that we play a role in addressing climate change and nature decline, and to future-proof our economy and that of communities along global supply chains. And it's also clear that this is a crucial moment to be taking action on this, as the UK prepares to obviously host the COP later this year, and as the UK and countries globally look to respond to the economic impact of the pandemic. And we seriously hope that the UK government and others will not miss this opportunity. This is a conversation the Green Alliance will continue to contribute to, including through some forthcoming work, making the case for tackling the UK's consumption emissions and exploring the policy levers to reduce the country's carbon footprint. So watch this space, there will be more on this agenda. And before I go, I just want to thank all the speakers for joining us today and for providing such excellent insight. Thank you also to the audience for all your comments and questions. The event has been recorded and will be available on the Green Alliance YouTube channel later today. And so it just remains me to say thank you all very much for joining us for this discussion, and have a good day.